This lecture examines the classical town halls in the northeast of England. It's based on research I conducted for my book Great Public Buildings of the Northeast, which was published in 2024. The book examines the town halls and civic centres of northeast England, ranging from the Baroque town houses of the 18th century through the eclectic town halls of the Victorian era to the modernist civic centres of the 20th century. Politically, town halls are literal centres of power, the democratic forums of civic administration. Architecturally, they are inherently symbolic, proclaiming the status, values, and identity of their respective towns and cities. This talk focuses specifically on town halls designed in the classical style of architecture and its derivatives. Classicism was, of course, introduced to the region through Roman military occupation. Centuries later, the style was revived as a symbol of status and enlightenment. Specifically, during the Georgian era, architects like Sir John Vanbrugh introduced dramatic Baroque elements to the region's architecture. Subsequently, Tyneside classicism flourished in the early 19th century through the work of architects like John Dobson, Thomas Oliver Sr., and John and Benjamin Green. Among the first civic buildings were the townhouses of the 18th century, which signalled the growing importance of provincial towns in the Georgian era. Morpeth, the county town of Northumberland, became one of the most important cattle markets in the country, and recognising Morpeth's growing importance, Charles Howard, the third Earl of Carlisle, erected an imposing town hall in 1714. This was designed by Sir John Vanbrugh, a leader of the English Baroque school. Vanbrugh's association with the Earl began in 1699, when the latter commissioned Vanbrugh to design Castle Howard in North Yorkshire, one of England's greatest Baroque houses. Emerging towards the end of the Renaissance, the Baroque style was an exaggerated form of classical and Renaissance architecture, distorting its idealized forms to produce effects of grandiosity, movement, and spatial complexity. Vanbrugh's buildings communicate through superhuman proportions and bold massing, many having what he called a castle air, as at Seaton Delaval Hall in Northumberland. Following the basic configuration of Vanbrugh's country houses, Morpeth Town Hall has a dominant central block framed by corner towers, producing a dramatic silhouette. In scale and proportion, however, the building is more akin to Vanbrugh's smaller garden structures, such as this summer house at Grimsthorpe Castle in Lincolnshire. The entire facade is rusticated, a term referring to various ways of shaping stone blocks to evoke the rugged quality of hypothetical rustic buildings, hence the name. The detailing of the towers at Morpeth Town Hall anticipates Vanbrugh's first design for Eastbury, a country house in Dorset. His designs for this building were contemporary with those for Morpeth Town Hall. In both cases, the towers are rectangular rather than square in plan, and they terminate with massive upper stages pierced by round-headed arches and crowned with open pediments. A pediment is described as open when part of the lower bar is missing, as in this case. Eastbury was eventually built to a revised design with slightly different towers. So the towers seen in this second design on the screen, which bear resemblance to those at Morpeth Town Hall, are a fascinating record of the development of Vanbragh's architectural language at this time. It has been said that the towers resemble sentry boxes, recalling Vanbragh's nostalgia for military fortifications, because he was a former soldier. Vanbragh's building was apparently destroyed by fire in the 1860s, although I found no record of this in local newspaper reports. Nevertheless, it was reported that the town hall was rebuilt between 1868 and 1870 at a cost of £10,000, provided by the 8th Earl of Carlisle. The talented Newcastle architect Robert James Johnson was responsible for the reconstruction. He had purchased the architectural practice of John Dobson after the latter's death, and this may explain how he received the commission for Morpeth Town Hall, since Dobson would have been the optimal choice for this work. Johnson's facade was said to be an exact facsimile of the original, and he was assisted by Benjamin Ferry's drawings of the town hall, which he made when he came to Morpeth to design St James's Church in the 1840s. Johnson designed new interiors in a complementary 18th century style. This room served as a courthouse, guildhall, and ballroom. Both the original building and its reconstruction were the result of aristocratic patronage, and it was infused with signs of aristocratic power. The mantelpiece above the fireplace displays the armorial emblems of the Earls of Carlisle. Charles Howard's monogram was incorporated into the pediment on the facade during the rebuilding, and a portrait bust of the 7th Earl of Carlisle was installed in a niche above the staircase, executed in Carrara marble by the Irish sculptor John Henry Foley, who is best known for sculpting the statue of Daniel O'Connell in Dublin, and also the statue of Prince Albert at the Albert Memorial in London. Vanbragh's influence in Northumberland is apparent at Berwick upon Tweed, the northernmost town in England. Berwick prospered thanks to a flourishing cloth industry and the export of wool to Flanders. The town hall was built by the local guild between 1754 and 1751, echoing the rugged spirit of Vanbrugh. It was designed by Joseph Dodds, who was a local carpenter. He had no experience of undertaking such a project, so the Guild sent his plans to architects in London for approbation and inspection. One of the firms consulted was that of Samuel and John Worrell, who subsequently submitted plans of their own. The completed building seems to have been an amalgam of both designs, although Dodds took care to have his name inscribed under the pediment of the building to signal his authorship, or at least his contribution. A steep flight of steps sweeps up to an impressive tetrastyle portico, meaning it is carried upon 4 columns. The design bears a clear resemblance to James Gibbs's Church of St Martin in the Fields in London, which was a highly influential building due to its then unconventional juxtaposition of a classical temple portico and a soaring tower and spire. The pediment at Berwick Town Hall features a fine representation of the borough's coat of arms, giving the expression of civic pride typical of town hall design. This is the rear elevation of the building, featuring a Venetian window in the first floor and an arcade formed of rugged, rusticated arches. This had originally served as a butter market, and again it demonstrates the rugged spirit of John Vanbrugh. This is a view of the council chamber, which retains a plaster relief of Justice by the sculptor Joseph Alexander, as well as classical detailing. But as we can see, it also exhibits the space-age furniture that was introduced in the 1960s. Durham's first seat of civic administration was a Guildhall erected in 1356. This timber structure was rebuilt by Bishop John Cuson in 1665. Cuson's Guildhall was given a Palladian-style facade by John Bell in 1754, as we can see in this drawing by the architect and architectural historian Martin Roberts. By the 19th century, the Guildhall had become too small to function effectively, and a Gothic town hall was built around it, 2 designs by Philip Charles Hardwick. As part of this process, the Palladian facade was Gothicized, as we can see in this second drawing by Martin Roberts. This is Durham Town Hall today, which is convincingly medieval and refreshingly modest for a Victorian town hall, given how bombastic some of these buildings could be. This brings us to the subject of Victorian town halls. In the 19th century, urban expansion necessitated reform in local government. The Municipal Reform Act of 1835 established 178 municipal corporations, each governed by an elected council. This growth in municipal bureaucracy demanded buildings for its administration and its symbolic expression, because a town hall was a vital component of any aspiring Victorian town or city. So town halls became one of the most important building types of the 19th century. They must be seen as products of the new urban consciousness emerging in this age of transformation and optimism. As one commentator put it, writing in an architectural journal called The Building News in 1896, 19th century architecture will be written mainly not in its great churches nor monuments, but in the record of its municipal and civic buildings. Its town halls and city offices, its technical schools, and its libraries, museums, its public baths and washhouses will form the material of the future historian who undertakes to write the chronicle of its progress. In terms of patronage, municipal and commercial bodies generally replaced the aristocratic patrons of the 18th century. The usual way of obtaining designs for town halls in the Victorian era was to hold an architectural competition. However, many of these were mismanaged and drew accusations of corruption. This brings us to John Johnson. He was a Scottish architect based in Newcastle, and he designed more of the region's town halls than any other architect. And this is partly because he had the uncanny knack of obtaining civic commissions even when he had not won the related competition. In fact, some commentators alleged that backstair influence came into play when Johnson was able to acquire these commissions. His design for Newcastle Town Hall came third in the competition, but was ultimately chosen by the corporation. The site was inconvenient, and Newcastle's leading architect, John Dobson, criticised its selection. The resulting building was widely criticised, yet it was actually pioneering. Breaking with academic tradition, Newcastle Town Hall was one of the first in the country to make free use of classical and Renaissance styles, combining them. This eclectic approach afforded flexibility in the planning of what was a notoriously complex building type. The main elevation, which we can see in this image, featured sculpted figures representing the trade and commerce of the time, again expressing civic pride and civic identity. These were carved by the Newcastle builder and sculptor Walter Scott. The site for the town hall abutted a corn exchange which was owned by the corporation. Many secondary sources have indicated that the corn exchange was simply incorporated into the town hall building, but primary sources indicate that at Johnson's suggestion, the existing corn exchange was actually taken down and rebuilt on stronger foundations, and this allowed a new story to be built above the corn exchange, and this housed a music hall. In the background of this image, we can just see what was the corn exchange with the music hall erected on top. And this is a view inside the music hall upon its opening. Here we can see the opposite end of the town hall facing the big market. Its design was praised by the Newcastle Courant, writing, "Every inhabitant of this northern metropolis may point with pride to the new town hall buildings as among the noblest ornaments of a town not wanting in architectural beauty." In truth, the building fell short of the standard of Tyneside classicism, and it is surprising that John Dobson was not simply commissioned to design a town hall on an appropriate site. He certainly could have produced a building worthy of Newcastle's classical urban centre. Beyond Newcastle newspapers, the building was criticised heavily. surveying Newcastle in 1881, Building News wrote that it was a wretched collection of old classic, badly adapted from various works by Inigo Jones, Sir Christopher Wren, and other classical architects. The building was eventually demolished in 1973, but fragments of its stonework, including the allegorical sculpture by Walter Scott, was incorporated into the office blocks erected on its site. If you can tolerate an intrusion of the Gothic style, I would like to discuss Bishop Auckland Town Hall. A competition was held in 1860, and this was won by an Irish architect based in London named John Philpot Jones. I discovered that he actually produced two designs, one Gothic in style, which we can see here, and one classical. Jones advised the committee to adopt the Gothic design because it would be cheaper to execute because its visual impact arose from massing and proportion rather than detailed ornamentation. The committee accepted Jones's advice, partly because the town hall site was adjacent to the Gothic church of St. Anne, and they didn't want a classical design to contrast with it unduly. And this demonstrates that amid the Victorian battle of the styles, the intense rivalry between the Gothic and the classical styles, municipal building committees were not necessarily partisan, but were influenced in their decision by contingent factors. This building proved to be controversial. Although Jones won the competition, the committee appointed another architect to modify the designs and complete the project. As you may have guessed, that architect was John Johnston. When Jones heard that another architect had been engaged, he asked for his drawings to be returned, and they were, but not before tracings had been taken, and this enabled John Johnston to simplify Jones's design so that it could be built more economically. This is the building that was eventually erected. Johnston has omitted the tower, although he has built this small Gothic spire, and he also simplified the massing of the roofs. In fact, this was one of the first town halls in Britain to use French pavilion roofs, which are sometimes loosely called mansard roofs after the French architect Francois Mansart. And these were valuable because they helped to articulate or break down the mass of large buildings, and they could be adapted for classical and Gothic designs. Hexham Town Hall was yet another civic building designed by John Johnston. It was built of stone from the local Prudham quarry near Hexham, and it exemplifies the free Renaissance style of which he was a pioneer. So it has the same eclecticism and freedom of Newcastle Town Hall, but I would argue that its design was more successful. One of the functions of this building was to provide a permanent venue for weekly agricultural markets, so it incorporated a corn exchange. The building has a tripartite Palladian arrangement, but surprisingly, the town hall lay not in the central block as we might expect, but in the southern wing. It was the Corn Exchange that occupied the central block, and this demonstrates that this component of the building was deemed to be even more important than the town hall. And this demonstrates the significance of agriculture and corn trading to Hexham's economy. The central pediment was intended to be surmounted by a figure of Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture, and contemporary newspaper reports indicate that this statue was erected. However, I've never been able to find a historic image to confirm that. According to newspaper reports, the statue held in her left hand a cornucopia, or horn of plenty, and in her right hand a sickle. These elements defined Hexham as the agricultural centre of Northumberland and stressed, through the symbolic language of classical gods, the importance of bountiful harvests to its economy. This photograph shows the interior of the former Corn Exchange. It has now been converted into a library, but we can see the gracefulness of the Victorian cast iron structure that was built to enshrine the Corn Exchange. The process of building Gateshead Town Hall was tortuous, involving 2 architectural competitions, 2 different sites, and protracted negotiations. The usual controversy came into play. The building that was eventually constructed was designed yet again by John Johnston. Like Hexham Town Hall, the building was designed in a free Renaissance style, this time drawing influence from the town palaces of Venice. Johnston was eclectic even by Victorian standards and was well known for his love of ornamentation and detail. The crowning pediment has allegorical figures of industry, justice, and commerce, representing the standard civic values of the period, although the central figure has since been removed. The group is surmounted by a statue of Queen Victoria. We can see the statues in more detail, as well as the goat head emblems that Johnston incorporated in reference to the possible origin of Gateshead's name. The history of Sunderland's municipal architecture is a tragic saga involving a much-loved Victorian town hall and a controversial but innovative civic centre, both of which fell prey to the wrecking ball. To build the original town hall, a competition was held in 1886, and this time a professional assessor was appointed in the hope of ensuring a transparent competition. The assessor was Alfred Waterhouse, who was a prolific, highly successful architect and a very well-respected figure, who often adjudicated architectural competitions. However, the winning design was submitted by Brightwen Binyon of Ipswich, who had trained under Alfred Waterhouse and was a fellow Quaker, so the competition drew accusations of corruption. Rising from a rusticated base, the facades of Sunderland Town Hall combined bold classical forms, including columns of the Corinthian order and powerful entablatures, with richer, more graceful Renaissance details, such as the round-headed arches, of the windows. The outer bays were treated as pavilions, emphasised visually, and arrayed with giant columns, as we've mentioned, and these were surmounted by French pavilion roofs. The entire structure was faced with Prudham stone, as at Hexham Town Hall. Many town halls had towers, but most of these were built solely for visual impact. But Sunderland was an exception. The building was ventilated by means of extraction flues that were carried into a shaft in the tower, so it actually had a functional purpose. The published plans reveal the integral components of Victorian town hall design. We can see that the entrance led into a vestibule and thence to the main staircase, which was worked in Dennick stone from Northumberland and augmented with columns of polished red granite. These formed a spectacular procession which swept visitors up to the lavish council chamber and mayor's parlour. We've seen this image already, but I've drawn upon the architectural plans to articulate the anatomy of the town hall, explaining how each individual internal space functioned. We can see that the mayor's room overlooked Fawcett Street. Behind that was an anteroom leading into the council chamber. And another principal room at the opposite end was the reception room. Here we can see the entrance hall, again, which was worked partly in Dennick stone. There's also extensive tile work and the red granite columns. This is the reception room, which was used for public meetings and entertainments. These had been a component of town hall design since the assembly rooms of the Georgian era. And here we can see a view of the council chamber, which had essentially a horseshoe-shaped arrangement of seating as recommended by Victorian experts in town hall design. Unfortunately, Sunderland Town Hall soon came too small to function and was demolished by the then Tory Council in 1971, an ignominious fate for the embodiment of Sunderland's civic pride. The turn of the century witnessed the revival of the exuberant Baroque style of Sir John Vanbrugh and others of the Georgian era. Baroque became almost an official idiom for government buildings during the Edwardian era, a triumphalist expression of national and civic pride. Jarrow Town Hall was designed by the obscure architect Fred Reynoldson. The exterior facing consists of bright red brick and terracotta, giving the building a fiery red colour. There was a fashion for architectural ceramics and chromatic facades in the 1900s, exemplified by Old Shire Hall in Durham and the Dorman Museum in Middlesbrough, all of which were built within a few years of Jarrow Town Hall. So this was a fashionable approach for the time. However, Sir Nicolaus Pevsner called Jarrow Town Hall vulgar in its design. The council chamber housed a mayor's dais in fumed oak and red Moroccan leather. Stained glass commemorates the philanthropy of local industrialists and politicians. Here, for example, is a stained glass window commemorating the philanthropy of Sir Charles Mark Palmer, industrialist and local MP. Ostensibly, town halls were symbols of democracy. However, many were financed by powerful private citizens, typically industrial magnates. Potent myths of their enterprise and benevolence were woven into the fabric of town halls by means of statuary, commemorative inscriptions, and stained glass. And with this splendid scenography, Victorian and Edwardian town halls were essentially theatres of capitalism, portraying capitalism as the basis of a benevolent social order. The region's finest civic building is South Shields Town Hall, which was built between 1905 and 1900. This was designed by Ernest Edward Fetch of London as the result of 2 architectural competitions. Even after the final design had been selected, the South Shields Municipal Reform League objected to what it saw as the excessive cost of furnishing the building, and this obliged Fetch to substitute cheaper materials in its execution. Transcending these difficulties, South Shields Town Hall is nevertheless a true civic palace. Despite the Edwardian vogue for Baroque architecture, the facades are broadly classical, with chased pilasters and triangular pediments, but it does have a tower at one corner to disrupt symmetry characteristic of the Edwardian mode. The centrepiece is a sublime aedicule which frames the entrance. Here we can see a dramatic open pediment supporting allegorical figures carved by Hibbert Charles Binney. A heroic figure of Neptune and a nymph of the Tyne recline on the pediment, the latter reflecting the influence of the Art Nouveau style then flourishing in Europe. A triumphant figure of Britannia is seated at the apex. Symmetry is disrupted by the dramatic addition of a clock tower. This was characteristic of Edwardian Baroque architecture. Statues representing the 4 seasons stand at the corners of the towers, again sculpted by Binney, and a weather vane in the form of an Elizabethan galleon proclaims South Shields' maritime prowess. The interior is equally fine. From the magnificent foyer, the visitor is expertly choreographed through a graceful sequence of columned marble halls and corridors. The climax is the council chamber, where the seating is arranged in a horseshoe formation around a mayor's dais. In the early 20th century, the lower floors were used as a medical clinic, and for this reason the walls were lined with glazed bricks in iridescent colours, as we can see in this image. These are complemented by stained glass, essentially in the Art Nouveau tradition, but actually anticipating Art Deco in their design. In conclusion, town halls fulfill the dual function of enshrining power and expressing civic identity. Each town hall represents its respective town or city. Collectively, the town halls of the North East represent the region in all of its variety. Whether beautiful or bombastic, these buildings form the symbolic heart of the region's towns and cities.